This is the last of 4 lectures on critical methodologies in Old Testament. And this lecture will be on reader-oriented approaches, which include reader response criticism, deconstructionism, liberation theology, and feminist literary criticism. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. Reader-oriented approaches to the text. Reader-oriented approaches to the text emphasizes the reader rather than the historical backdrop. First of all, there was historical criticism, and the emphasis on historical criticism was on the author. And they were really interested in the author, his historical backdrop, his biography, and things of that nature. But the weakness was that, well, what does the text mean today? So we figure out what it meant way back then, but what does it mean today? And questions about the author are not always resolvable. So maybe we don't know the historical backdrop or the biography of the author very well. And in pursuing historical questions, the text was in some ways left behind. But then along came another approach called New Criticism in the 1970s, and that emphasized not the author, but the text. Emphasizing not does the author mean, but what does the text mean? And so it examines themes and images and character and plot and style and metaphor and point of view and narrators and readers implied and real and so on and so forth. Even where there are historical issues, where those are elusive, you could still raise those kinds of questions. And that became popular in biblical studies in the 1970s. But then, since the 1980s, there has been a movement from the text to the reader. So you start with what the author meant. You went to what the text says, but now you go to the reader, and the question is, well, what does the text mean to me as a reader? And that what it means to me as a reader is more important than what it says or what the author meant. Now, reader response criticism has been promoted by a number of people. A few years ago, Stanley Fish was one of the leading proponents. He says the text does not exist apart from the reader's interpretive act. And it emphasizes interpretive communities for whom the same text can mean different things depending on who the community is that's reading the text. And so the text doesn't have a meaning other than the interpretive act of it. That's where the meaning lies. And so there's a hermeneutical issue here. Can we objectively interpret a text? If the meaning depends on who we are and what our philosophical commitments are, if that's true, and that's what this approach assumes, well, then we can never objectively analyze a text, which then raises the question, well, why even try? And so these approaches wear their ideological commitments on their sleeves and interpret the text in the light of the ideology to which they have already committed themselves. Now, a related version of this is an approach called Deconstructionism, sometimes also called post-structuralism. It was promoted by a Frenchman named Jacques Derrida, who died in 2004. And it was very popular among the English departments back a couple of decades ago, and emphasized the fact that we can never determine what a text originally meant. We can only determine what the text means to you. And so he promoted this approach, and it influenced a whole generation of literary critics, and again, not biblical per se, but reading literature in general. I might add that since his death, his influence directly in France has waned a bit. And yet, especially in the United States, his ideas have been so influential that the next generation seems to be passing this approach to reading texts right along. You might call this approach a hermeneutical nihilism. Again, very popular in the modern English literary department starting around 1990. And to deconstruct a discourse is to show how it undermines the philosophy it asserts or the hierarchical oppositions on which it relies. In other words, the message of the text falls apart upon close reading of it in the approach of Derrida. Example of deconstruction might be the way that one could approach the book of Job. Job tries to explain why the righteous suffer. But when you examine the text of Job carefully, it really doesn't give a good explanation as to why the righteous suffer. So instead of trying to say what the text says, the text having deconstructed itself, let's just go on and say, well, let me tell you my feelings about how the righteous suffer, or why the righteous suffer. And so it goes again from the author and text to the subjective feeling of the reader. And that's the approach of deconstructionism. Now, there's some objections to this approach, obviously. Deconstructionism itself deconstructs. Derrida complained often that people misunderstood him. But if his own theory were true, of course they misunderstand him, because nobody can really understand what a text means. You can only say what it means to you. And thus, he was unable to live with his own theory, which he proposed. Moreover, deconstructionism undermines civil society and religion. If it's true that one could never agree on what a law meant, or what a contract meant, or what a set of instructions meant, and this approach, which is common in law already, where progressives on the Supreme Court feel free to reinterpret the words of the Constitution at whim, as long as it fits their political agenda. They say what it means to them, or what they think it ought to mean, rather than objectively trying to figure out what the author meant. And of course, if you apply this to the Bible, it obviously destroys any kind of Bible-based religion. The whole Protestant movement would be deconstructed if it adopted deconstructionism as a hermeneutic. Now, not unrelated to this is liberation theologies, or you might call it Marxist literary criticism. Marxist literary criticism views the Bible as a paradigm for liberation from present-day oppression. And the Bible then is read under the categories of Marxist analysis. Marxist analysis tries to put everything in the category of class struggles, or struggle between one intersectional group and another intersectional group. So struggles of the oppressed versus the oppressor would be another way of looking at that. And from an economic point of view, it tends to emphasize the economic analysis of the means of production. And they basically read the Bible on the assumption that Marxist ideology is correct and try to find in it struggles between the oppressed and the oppressor. And in some stories, it works reasonably well. This liberation theology, by the way, has been very common in South America, where you can see that, well, you have the poor people that are the oppressed class, you have the rich people that are the oppressors. And they would look at, for example, the Exodus from Egypt, where Israel was oppressed by the Egyptians and set free and by God and left to head towards the Promised Land, as a paradigm for how to analyze things today. Yet another approach, and again, not unrelated to Marxist literary criticism, is feminist literary criticism. Feminist literary criticism advocates, you might say, a politically correct approach to literature in English departments. And at least in terms of its analysis of the Bible, the method is to read the Bible in the light of present-day oppressive structures of patriarchal society. You read the Bible in the light of present-day oppressive structures of patriarchal society, and this assumes the correctness of feminist ideology, and it draws upon Marxist ideology, which divides everything up into oppressed and oppressors. Here, women are the oppressed, and men, at least some men, are the oppressors. And they read the Bible in the light of that ideology. Now, there's different types of feminists who read the Bible. Radical feminism rejects the Bible as hopelessly oppressive of women and therefore want nothing to do with it at all. Others, liberal Christian feminists, including the lady at the left, Phyllis Tribble, try to salvage what they can from the Bible. She wrote one of her books, Texts of Terror, Literary Feminist Readings of Biblical Narratives. They try to salvage from the Bible what they can. So they reject the Bible when it teaches patriarchalism, wives be subject to your own husbands. That's unacceptable. But then they point to what they consider more helpful texts, like Galatians 3:28, in Christ there's neither male nor female, and quote those texts as supportive of their egalitarianism. And then there's yet another type of feminism, which I would call evangelical feminism. And what evangelical feminism tries to do is to affirm that a high view of the Bible is not inconsistent with holding to some tenets of feminism. And you can at least, as an example, advocating equal pay for equal work. Well, you could hold to that and not affirm a lot of the more negative aspects of feminism, and yet that's a feminist idea. Anyway, these evangelical feminists refer to themselves as egalitarian Christians, wanting as much as possible to have equal roles between men and women. And they would say, yes, there's patriarchy in the Bible, but that patriarchy is descriptive of what was going on in the culture of that day, but it's not prescriptive of what we must and should do today. So just because there was patriarchy in the Old Testament and patriarchy in Paul's day doesn't mean that we must be patriarchs today with giving male priority. Now, to accomplish this, a progressive hermeneutic is applied. And the progressive hermeneutic works this way. The Bible's statements about women applied to them then in that cultural setting. But because our cultural setting has changed, then certain of the directives in the Bible about women that were true then would not be true today. And so, as we move closer to the end of the age, to the eschaton, where there will be neither male nor female, as we move closer to that, then egalitarian relationships between men and women should come ever closer and closer to reality. That's evangelical feminism and their progressive hermeneutic. Now, if you want to study more about this, proponents and critics of evangelical feminism, proponent would be Christians for Biblical Equality. You can go to a search engine and find their website and learn more about their ideology and approach to the Bible. And then opponents of that would be the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Well, all of these approaches that in this particular part of the lecture are reader-oriented approaches that emphasize who you are as a reader and the presuppositions that you have as a reader and how that may affect how you read the Bible. And so that concludes our introduction to critical methodologies, and my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.